Hello. The Divine Code reading for August 4th, pages 115 and 116. We're on the chapter on Sacrificial Offerings, continuing in topic number 3. One may not use stones that have been used for a mundane purpose. Rather, one must build it from newly gathered stones that were never used. Likewise, the kindling wood for burning the sacrifice must not have been used for any other purpose. This is out of Tractate Zivachim 116b. So something as it exists sort of in nature, over the course of time, building materials have been used and then discarded and then reused and discarded. Sometimes building materials are sort of taken off of older buildings, off of older, things that have been used before. If the stones had been used for a structure in the past, had been kind of scattered, and now you're reusing it, that would seem to be okay, because it was scattered at some time in the past, so now it's back to the sort of natural state. You don't want to be taking it off of another structure. And similar to the kindling wood, I mean the wood that's used for burning, you want it to be something you just go out, you're able to just go out and gather. You don't want it to have connections to some other activity. It is forbidden to derive benefit from the stones of this altar and anything remaining from the wood. The Jerusalem Talmud, Tractate Megillah, chapter 1, topic 11, relates that Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, Rebbe, told Ananias, a Gentile Roman leader, to bury the stones of the altar he built. Korban Ha'adiyah explains there that since this altar was sanctified for service to God, it could not be used for mundane purposes. It also appears that Rebbe held that there is no prohibition to a Gentile of "you shall not do so for God," in reference to breaking apart a personal altar that was made for the service to God. This means that although it is definitely forbidden for a Gentile to damage the altar or the sanctuary in the holy temple, because of the prohibition of disgracing holy articles, nevertheless, it is permitted to break apart a temporary personal altar. So we would not break apart the temple altar, the altar in the holy temple. We would not do that. However, for our own personal altar, we're allowed to break it apart, and we're required when we're no longer using it. We don't want it to be, people to take the altar to use it as for their own for sacrifices to something, to some entity other than Hashem, for idolatrous purposes, or to use the altar, the bricks of the altar. They say, hey, I need building bricks for some building, and they're going to scavenge the building materials from the altar. You do is you take the altar and you scatter it, and it's no longer associated with the altar. Just as building materials from a previous building, if they were scattered, they're no longer associated with the previous building. and could be used for an altar. At the end of the use of the altar, we then again scatter it, so it's no longer associated with the altar. And that's that. And then if somebody uses the building, uses the stones that happen to be the stones that were in the altar, but after they've been scattered, you can use those stones can later be used without being considered deriving benefit from the altar, the materials of the altar. And also the wood could be scattered, and then later on somebody would gather that happens to be the same wood, but because it had been scattered, it was nullified its connection to the altar. Once a Gentile was finished offering sacrifices on the altar, he should disassemble it and bury the stones and leftover wood in the ground, so that it should not be a stumbling block for others. For God forbid, someone else might sacrifice on it, but not to God alone, or use it for some mundane purposes, or to bow down to it. I'm sorry, continuing the footnote from before. However, one must specifically bury the stones so that they should not be left where others might find them and use them for some mundane benefit, or, God forbid, to make an altar for some form of idolatrous worship. Another reason for the permission to destroy a private altar is that in order that it not come to be used as a forbidden pillar, which may not be left standing. So another reason is that the altar might become like a gathering, like a memorial gathering spot, similar to a crucifix, which has no historic religious value, but became of religious value through the twisted ways that people understood things. They took something that's used for executions, and they wound up worshiping it, or using it in the bizarre form of worship. So, in a similar way, you would not want the altar somehow becomes like a gathering spot. Hey, we're going to gather by this location where the altar is, and it has a special they'll put a historic marker on it, for tourists to come and look at. We don't want that. One may not plant any tree next to the altar, as it says in Deuteronomy 16:21. You shall not plant an asherus, a tree that is worshipped, or any tree next to the altar of God. Since it was the practice of idol worshippers to plant trees next to their altars in order that people should gather there. Therefore, the verse connects this with the second part. You shall not plant a tree for yourself, and you shall not put up a pillar that God detests. Such as the pillar is forbidden because it is the practice of idol worshippers, so too the planting of trees next to an altar. So the trees can be used for several purposes. They can be used as an idol, where they're actually worshiping the tree. It can be used as an aid in the idol worship. It's somehow an active part of the idol worship. It's somehow the ritual of the idol worship involves it. or it can also just be a decorative thing. And we're not looking for that in connection with the altar. And therefore, you're not supposed to plant a tree in connection with the altar, that the personal altar is being built. Also, this indicates, in a roundabout way, it indicates that the altar is possibly more than just a one-time offering. It might be something that's used over a period. The altar might be used over a period of time. The dismantling of the altar then would be at the end of its being used in the service of God. That would seem to be the case here if we're being instructed not to plant a tree, and trees are usually a long-term thing. Topic number 4. It is only fitting to offer to God from the choicest portion, the choicest possible sacrifices, as it says in Genesis 4:4, and Abel brought from the firstborn of his sheep and their fats, and God turned to Abel and his sacrifice. If he brings a poor quality sacrifice as Cain did, he disgraces God, and it is possible that he will be punished for this. That's from the Exclamations by Rabbi Saadia Gaon on the Torah, on that same verse, Genesis 4:4. An animal with which a sin or immoral act was performed is not fit to be offered to God, for it is loathsome as a sacrifice. Tractate Zivachim 116a, according to one version, and it is likewise clear logically from the verse in Malachi 1:8. When you present a blind animal for a sacrifice, is nothing wrong? Present it, if you please, to your governor. Would he be pleased with you or show you favor? Said God, Master of legions. Therefore, from the onset, it is not fitting to offer a sacrifice anything that is loathsome to God. So we want to make sure that the sacrifice that's being picked out is of a higher quality. It's not Abel thought it made more. No, I'm sorry. Cain thought it made more sense that he would just take a regular of his crop, just a regular portion of his crop, and sacrifice that. He understood that God does not distinguish between good and bad, or good and mundane. That he understood that from God's perspective, it's all the same, and therefore it would be almost insulting to say, well, God is only going to want the good. Well, why would God think that? And therefore he felt it better, he felt it superior to just take of anything, just something from his crop. Whereas Abel he felt it necessary to bring the choicest parts. And from God's perspective, it really wouldn't matter. But the purpose of the sacrifice is not for God. The purpose of the sacrifice is for ourselves, is to improve ourselves. And we want to present, we're looking to improve, and connecting to that, we want to bring the best, because we're trying to elevate ourselves through the sacrifice, to benefit, to become a better person through the offering. So we want to strengthen what's best, and in that we're strengthening ourselves for the better. Therefore, yeah, so that's what we're trying to do here with bringing the choice, because otherwise we're not really accomplishing anything if we're not paying attention to the quality. We're not improving anything. An animal with which a sin or an immoral act was performed is not fit to be offered to God, for it is loathsome as a sacrifice. What sins with an animal are included with this prohibition? An animal that was served as an idol or served in some way for the service of idols, or one that was designated for idol worship, even if it was not yet actually used for that purpose, is forbidden to be used for an offering to God. Likewise, an animal with which a person committed bestiality, one that was given as a wage for a prostitute, or one that killed a person, these are all loathsome to God as a sacrifice. Nevertheless, if one transgressed and offered such an animal for the sake of God, the sacrifice is valid and accepted by God. It's still accepted. I mean, from God's perspective, it's not gonna, it'll still be acceptable. It's because God desires the person to improve is why God wants there to be the best in that person that's being offered. And he doesn't want us to be bringing our flaws and saying, here, I'm offering this to you. That doesn't benefit us to say I'm using this in the service of God. He wants us to be doing our utmost, and it's loathsome in the sense it's not that it matters to God, the sacrifice. What matters to God is that what we are bringing, what we're doing to ourselves, and that's what happens when an animal is brought that's not as it should be. It's still accepted, but it really doesn't benefit the person to do it in that way. Likewise, an animal with an outwardly visible blemish, or that is known to have a terminal illness or injury, is not fit to be offered as a sacrifice to God because it is not of superior quality. But after the fact, if one offered it, it is still valid and it is accepted. A stolen animal that is brought as a sacrifice is a disgrace to God. Even though other taints and sins that might be associated with the animal do not invalidate the sacrifice after the fact, a stolen animal is not accepted. We find this in the Rambam, the laws governing animals forbidden to be sacrificed on the altar, chapter 5, topic 7. since it would be performed through the sin of stealing. A person who is bringing the sacrifice is making it an extension of his sin. Therefore, it is not only unacceptable to God, but it is a further sin and a disgrace to him. And that's in Malachi chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. But you defiled it, God's name, by your saying, the table, altar of God, is loathsome. That is used for stolen sacrifice. Since you bring a stolen and the lame and the sick, and bring it as an offering, I shall accept it from your hand, says God. So while the other aspects of a less than perfect sacrifice is less than what it could be as far as the benefits for the person in giving the sacrifice, it doesn't really help the person if the person is sinning, actually committing a sin connected with it. If it was used, the issue of bestiality, if the person was committing the bestiality of himself versus somebody else who had done something with the animal, that connects the sin into it. And especially in the area of stealing, it it changes the status of the animal through the sacrifice. It's no longer, if a person steals an animal, he steals a sheep, he can still return the sheep up until the point that something happened to the sheep. And the sacrifice kills the sheep, therefore it's no longer a returnable state. And therefore the sacrifice becomes part of the stealing process. And therefore the sacrifice becomes part of the theft. And that is a double down, and the sacrifice is not accepted at that point. Furthermore, doing so is sin in itself, in addition to the original theft, and even after the fact is not accepted. So in that case, the sacrifice is not accepted at all. Thank you.